In the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, where the sun descends each evening into waters so deep they have swallowed the light of 10,000 dawns, there exists a silence that speaks of mysteries the world has long forgotten. The ocean stretches here for thousands upon thousands of miles, an expanse of blue so immense that early navigators believed they had discovered the edge of the world itself. Scattered across this liquid wilderness lie islands, tiny specks of rock and coral that rise from depths measuring miles beneath the surface, each one a punctuation mark in an otherwise endless sentence of water and sky. These islands, separated by distances that would take weeks to traverse even with modern vessels, seem almost accidental in their placement, as though some cosmic hand had simply scattered breadcrumbs across the greatest ocean on Earth and left them there to weather the patient grinding of waves and time. On clear nights, when the moon rises full over these isolated shores, casting its silver reflection across waters that have remained unchanged since before human memory began its imperfect recording, one might almost believe that the ocean holds secrets within its depths, knowledge that predates our understanding of history itself. For as long as humans have gazed across vast waters toward distant horizons, we have wondered what lies beyond our sight, what civilizations might have risen and fallen in places now claimed by the sea. This fundamental human curiosity, this need to populate the unknown with stories and possibilities, has given birth to legends that persist across centuries and cultures. In the Western imagination, no lost civilization captures the mind quite like Atlantis, that sophisticated island empire described by the philosopher Plato in dialogues written more than 2,000 years ago. Atlantis, with its concentric rings of water and land, its advanced technology and powerful navy, its ultimate destruction in a single catastrophic day and night, has become the template for every tale of vanished glory that followed. But the Atlantic Ocean, vast though it may be, represents only a fraction of the world's waters. Far to the west, or to the east, depending on one's perspective, lies an ocean so much larger that it dwarfs all others combined. The Pacific, named ironically for its perceived peacefulness by explorers who had yet to witness its typhoons and tsunamis, covers nearly 1/3 of the entire planet's surface. And within this immense expanse, scattered like memories across the face of deep time, lies the foundation for another lost continent legend, one that has captured the imagination of mystics, seekers, and dreamers for more than a century. This is the story of Mu, the Pacific's answer to Atlantis, a supposed motherland of humanity that allegedly sank beneath the waves thousands of years ago, taking with it an advanced civilization and leaving behind only fragments of its former glory on the islands that remained above water. It is a tale born from misunderstood archeology, nurtured by mysticism and wishful thinking, and sustained by the very human desire to believe that somewhere in our distant past we were greater than we are now. It is a story of how scientific hypotheses become transformed into spiritual certainties, how cultural artifacts get reinterpreted to fit predetermined narratives, and how the genuine achievements of real civilizations become overshadowed by romantic myths of sunken continents and lost wisdom. The legend of Mu would grow to encompass theories about Easter Island's mysterious Moai statues, about the origins of Polynesian cultures, about connections between ancient civilizations separated by thousands of miles of ocean. It would attract believers who saw in scattered stone ruins evidence of a unified global empire, who interpreted similarity in symbols and structures, as proof of a common source rather than independent human innovation. And like all enduring myths, it would reveal as much about the people who believed in it as about the past they claimed to be describing. To understand how this legend came to be, we must journey back to the late 19th century, to a time when the field of archaeology was still young, when the methods we now take for granted had yet to be established, and when the interpretation of ancient ruins often relied more on imagination than evidence. We must follow the footsteps of pioneering explorers through the jungles of Mexico, stand before the carved stones of ancient Maya cities, and witness how eagerness to make dramatic discoveries can lead even serious scholars astray. We must trace the evolution of a scientific hypothesis about lemurs and land bridges into a mystical doctrine about ancient root races and sunken homelands. And we must examine how one man's obsessive belief in a lost Pacific paradise would create a myth that persists, despite all evidence to the contrary, to this very day. The year was 1873, and the Yucatan Peninsula lay thick with humid air that clung to skin like a second presence, making every movement a struggle against heat and moisture that seemed to have weight. The jungle pressed in on all sides, verdant and aggressive, reclaiming with patient persistence any space that human hands ceased to defend. Ancient cities built by the Maya hundreds of years before lay hidden beneath layers of vegetation, their carved stones slowly disappearing under the embrace of roots and vines, their courtyards becoming home to spider monkeys and tropical birds whose calls echoed where human voices had once conducted ceremony in commerce. Into this challenging environment came a man named Augustus Le Plongeon, a British-born adventurer whose life had already taken him across multiple continents and through several careers before he turned his attention to the ruins of ancient civilizations. Le Plongeon had studied medicine, practiced photography in San Francisco during the Gold Rush era, worked in Peru documenting archaeological sites, and developed skills in languages both living and dead. He was a man of genuine talents and serious interests, someone who brought real skill to the work of documenting ancient structures through the revolutionary medium of photography. He was also, as would become abundantly clear, someone whose enthusiasm for discovery far exceeded his caution in interpretation. Le Plongeon had not come to the Yucatan alone. With him traveled Alice Dixon Le Plongeon, his wife and collaborator, herself an accomplished photographer who had learned the craft from her father, a pioneering figure in British photography. Together, the Le Plongeons would spend more than a decade exploring and documenting Maya sites, producing photographic records that remain valuable to this day, even as their interpretations of what they documented would be thoroughly discredited. They were among the first to use photography systematically in archaeological documentation, painstakingly capturing images of entire building facades by stitching together multiple exposures, processing their glass plate negatives in makeshift darkrooms housed within ancient structures, working in conditions that would have defeated less determined individuals. The Yucatan in the 1870s was not a place for the faint of heart. The region remained unstable from the caste war, a violent conflict between Maya peoples and Mexican government forces that had begun in 1847 and would continue in various forms for decades. Travel outside the colonial city of Merida required armed escorts. Ancient sites lay in territory controlled by independent Maya groups who had little reason to welcome outsiders. Disease, particularly yellow fever, claimed lives with terrible regularity. Alice Le Plongeon herself contracted yellow fever shortly after their arrival, surviving only through luck and constitution, rather than any effective medical treatment available at the time. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, the Le Plongeons threw themselves into their work with obsessive dedication. They learned to speak Yucatec Maya, consulting with local people about the ruins and their history. They hired laborers to help clear vegetation from ancient structures, revealing architectural marvels that had stood unseen by European eyes for centuries. They measured, photographed, sketched, and recorded, producing documentation that would prove invaluable to later researchers. At Uxmal, they systematically documented the governor's palace, the nunnery quadrangle, and the pyramid of the magician, creating a visual record of these structures as they existed in the late 19th century. But it was at Chichen Itza, the sprawling ancient city that had once been a center of Maya civilization, that Augustus Le Plongeon would make the discovery that would shape the rest of his life and, inadvertently, contribute to the creation of the Mu legend. In 1875, while excavating at a structure he called the Platform of the Eagles and Jaguars, Le Plongeon and his workers unearthed a remarkable sculpture. The statue depicted a reclining human figure, knees drawn up and head turned sharply to one side, with a flat surface on its stomach that suggested ritual use. The figure's posture was unique, unlike anything previously documented in Maya art, and the quality of the carving demonstrated sophisticated stoneworking technique. Le Plongeon named the statue Chakmul, a name whose meaning and etymology remain disputed among scholars, though he believed it to be appropriate Maya terminology. The name would stick, and today similar reclining figures found at other Maya and later Mesoamerican sites are generically called Chakmuls, regardless of their actual cultural context or proper indigenous names. But Le Plongeon saw in the statue far more than simply an impressive example of Maya sculpture. To him, the Chakmul represented a specific historical figure, a prince who had lived and died in political intrigues that Le Plongeon believed he could read in the murals and carvings of Chichen Itza. Le Plongeon had become convinced, through his study of Maya iconography and his own idiosyncratic translations of Maya glyphs, that he could reconstruct actual historical events from the artistic and architectural evidence. He looked at murals in the upper temple of the Jaguars and saw a narrative of royal succession, betrayal, and flight. He interpreted stylized images as portraits of specific individuals. He read carved glyphs as historical accounts, rather than as the religious and calendrical texts they actually were. From this selective interpretation, he constructed an elaborate story involving a Queen Mu, whose husband, Prince Chakmul, had been murdered, leading her to flee across the ocean to Egypt, where she would be deified as Isis. This interpretation was not simply creative or unconventional, it was fundamentally wrong in almost every respect. The Maya writing system was not yet deciphered in the 1870s, and Le Plongeon's attempts to translate it bore no relationship to what scholars would later determine to be the actual phonetic and logographic values of Maya glyphs. He was, essentially, seeing what he wanted to see, constructing elaborate historical narratives from images whose true meanings remained obscured to him. His background in Freemasonry influenced his interpretations, leading him to perceive Masonic symbols in Maya art and to construct theories about secret knowledge transmitted from the Americas to the Old World through ancient fraternal organizations. But Le Plongeon went further, connecting his Maya discoveries to broader theories about human civilization's origins and development. He had encountered the work of Abbé Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg, a French cleric and scholar who had spent years studying ancient Mexican and Maya texts, and who had proposed his own controversial theories about Mesoamerican history. Brasseur de Bourbourg had attempted to translate the Troano Codex, one of the few surviving Maya books, using a method based on Diego de Londa's 16th century alphabet, itself a problematic and incomplete rendering of how Maya glyphs worked. Through this flawed methodology, Brasseur de Bourbourg had produced translations that modern scholars recognize as complete fabrications, bearing no relationship to the codex's actual content. In one particularly imaginative passage of what Brasseur de Bourbourg interpreted as his translation, he believed he had found references to a catastrophic destruction of a land he read as Mu. He identified this Mu with Atlantis, suggesting that the Troano Codex contained a Maya account of the destruction of Plato's famous island.
Modern scholars have since demonstrated that this interpretation had no basis in the actual content of the codex, which deals with divination and ritual matters rather than historical events. This was exactly the kind of dramatic discovery that appealed to Le Plongeon's romantic sensibilities and his belief in connections between ancient civilizations. He seized upon Brasseur de Bourbourg's mistranslation and incorporated it into his own evolving theory about Maya origins. Le Plongeon proposed that the Maya civilization had not developed independently in Mesoamerica, but had instead originated from a great civilization that had existed in the Atlantic Ocean. This civilization, which he associated with both Atlantis and the mysterious Mu mentioned in Brasseur de Bourbourg's translation, had, according to Le Plongeon, sent out colonies to various parts of the world before its destruction. The Maya, he argued, were direct descendants of these Atlantean colonists, and their advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and architecture derived from this ancient source rather than from their own cultural development. More provocatively still, Le Plongeon claimed that the Maya had themselves served as the originators of Egyptian civilization. He pointed to superficial similarities between pyramids in Mexico and Egypt, ignoring the fundamental architectural and functional differences between these structures. He highlighted symbols that appeared in both Maya and Egyptian art, such as serpents and solar imagery, without acknowledging that such symbols appear in human cultures worldwide as responses to universal human experiences and observations. He even went so far as to claim that the Maya language had influenced ancient Greek, a linguistic theory that had no basis in any credible comparative analysis. In his book Sacred Mysteries Among the Mayas and the Quiches, published in 1886, Le Plongeon laid out these theories in elaborate detail. He described the Maya as missionaries, which he called the Naukals, who had traveled from their homeland across the Pacific and then around the world, establishing civilizations and imparting knowledge wherever they went. Egypt, Greece, Chaldea, and India had all, according to Le Plongeon, received their fundamental cultural and religious knowledge from these Maya Naukals. The symbols of Freemasonry, he argued, could be traced back through this lineage to the original wisdom of the Maya. The archaeological and academic community received Le Plongeon's theories with skepticism that quickly hardened into rejection. By the 1880s, enough was known about Maya, Egyptian, and other ancient civilizations to make clear that Le Plongeon's proposed connections had no foundation. The chronologies didn't work. The linguistic connections he claimed to have found were products of his imagination rather than genuine etymological relationships. The historical evidence pointed to independent development of these civilizations, rather than diffusion from a common source. Scholars who actually understood how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs and who were beginning to make genuine progress in deciphering Maya scripts could see that Le Plongeon's translations were fantasy. Yet Le Plongeon persevered in promoting his ideas, challenging what he called armchair archaeologists to debate him while citing his years of fieldwork as evidence of his authority. He wrote letters to scientific journals, delivered lectures, and published additional books, including Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx in 1896. He argued passionately that future discoveries would vindicate his interpretations and prove the connections he claimed to have uncovered. But as archaeological methods became more sophisticated and knowledge of ancient civilizations deepened, Le Plongeon's theories moved further and further outside the mainstream, until he was regarded by most scholars as an eccentric whose genuine contributions to photography and site documentation had been overshadowed by increasingly untenable interpretations. Le Plongeon died in 1908, still convinced of his theories, never wavering in his belief that the Maya had preceded and influenced all other civilizations. His wife Alice survived him by only 2 years. Together, they left behind a valuable photographic archive of Maya sites and a cautionary tale about how passionate belief can lead serious individuals to construct elaborate theories on insufficient evidence. But they also left something else, something that would take on a life of its own and evolve in directions they could never have anticipated. That word mu, which Brasseur de Bourbourg had mistakenly extracted from the Truano Codex, would not disappear with Le Plongeon's discredited theories. Instead, it would be picked up, reinterpreted, and transformed into something entirely different by others who came after. While Le Plongeon was conducting his controversial research in the Yucatan, on the other side of the world, a completely different intellectual tradition was developing that would eventually merge with and transform his ideas about lost continents. This tradition had its origins not in archaeology or ancient texts, but in the scientific puzzle of how species came to be distributed across the globe in patterns that seemed to defy simple explanation. In the mid-19th century, as naturalists cataloged the flora and fauna of distant regions, they encountered geographical distributions that raised perplexing questions about how animals and plants had reached their current locations. One such puzzle involved a small primate called the lemur. These distinctive creatures, with their large eyes and long tails, lived primarily on the island of Madagascar off the eastern coast of Africa. But fossil evidence showed that lemurs or their close relatives had once existed in India as well, on the opposite side of the Indian Ocean. Yet there were no lemurs in Africa itself, nor in the Middle East, the regions that lay between Madagascar and India. How had these animals come to exist in two widely separated locations without leaving any trace in the land between? In 1864, a British zoologist named Philip Lutley Sclater published a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Science titled The Mammals of Madagascar. In this paper, Sclater proposed a solution to the lemur distribution puzzle that seemed reasonable given the scientific understanding of his time. He suggested that Madagascar and India had once been connected by a large landmass that had subsequently sunk beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean. This hypothetical continent would have allowed lemurs to spread between the two regions when they were still joined by land. After the connection disappeared beneath the sea, the lemur populations on Madagascar and India became isolated, evolving separately while leaving no trace on the now separated landmasses of Africa and the Middle East. Sclater named this hypothetical landmass Lemuria after the lemurs whose distribution it was meant to explain. The concept was purely utilitarian, a proposed geographical feature that would account for observed biogeographical patterns. Sclater was not suggesting any lost civilization or ancient human connection. He was simply trying to solve a scientific puzzle using the tools available to him. And in the context of mid-19th century Earth science, before the theory of continental drift and plate tectonics had been developed, the idea of sunken land bridges seemed like a plausible explanation for otherwise mysterious distribution patterns. Other scientists found Sclater's hypothesis useful and began incorporating it into their own work. The concept of Lemuria gained traction in scientific circles, particularly among those studying biogeography and the distribution of species. Land bridges and sunken continents seemed like reasonable mechanisms for explaining how plants and animals had spread across now separated landmasses. After all, if the Earth's surface was relatively stable, as most geologists of the time believed, then changes in sea level or localized sinking of land seemed like logical ways to account for geographical changes over time. In 1870, a German biologist and philosopher named Ernst Haeckel picked up Sclater's idea and applied it to a different question entirely. Haeckel was a strong advocate of evolutionary theory and was particularly interested in human origins and development. He disagreed with Charles Darwin's hypothesis that humans had originated in Africa, instead favoring Asia as the birthplace of humanity. Haeckel proposed that Lemuria, the landmass Sclater had hypothesized to explain lemur distribution, had actually been the original homeland of the human species. Haeckel suggested that the so-called missing link, the hypothetical transitional form between apes and humans that evolution predicted should exist, but which had not yet been found in the fossil record, would eventually be discovered in Lemuria. Of course, since Lemuria was supposedly sunk beneath the Indian Ocean, the fossils of these transitional human ancestors would remain conveniently out of reach, explaining why they had not yet been found. This was a classic example of an unfalsifiable hypothesis, one that could not be disproven because the evidence was claimed to be inaccessible, but it seemed to offer a tidy solution to a vexing problem in evolutionary theory. Through Haeckel's writings and those of other scientists who found the Lemuria hypothesis useful, the concept gained wider currency in late 19th century scientific and popular literature. It appeared in academic papers, in natural history museums displays, and in popular science writings aimed at educated general audiences. For a time, Lemuria seemed like a legitimate scientific hypothesis, one among several proposed land bridges and sunken continents that geologists and biogeographers used to explain observed patterns in nature. But even as Lemuria was gaining scientific respectability, the foundations of geology were beginning to shift in ways that would eventually make the hypothesis obsolete. Evidence was accumulating that the Earth's surface was not as stable as had been assumed. Mountain ranges showed signs of having been pushed up by tremendous forces. Rock layers appeared folded and thrust over one another in ways that suggested large-scale movement. Fossils found on different continents seemed to match not just in species, but in the specific rock layers and geological contexts in which they appeared, suggesting that these continents might once have been connected. The German meteorologist Alfred Wegener would eventually assemble this evidence into his theory of continental drift, published in the early 20th century, which proposed that continents actually moved across the Earth's surface over geological time. Wegener's theory, though initially rejected by most geologists, would eventually be vindicated and expanded into the modern theory of plate tectonics in the 1960s. Once scientists understood that continents moved through the action of tectonic plates, the need for hypothetical land bridges and sunken continents disappeared. The distribution of lemurs and other species could be explained by plate tectonics. India and Madagascar had been part of larger land masses that broke apart and drifted to their current positions, carrying their flora and fauna with them. But by the time plate tectonics revolutionized Earth science, Lemuria had already undergone a transformation that moved it far beyond the realm of scientific hypothesis. The concept had been discovered by individuals interested not in zoology or geology, but in mysticism and esoteric spirituality. These people would take Sclater's utilitarian land bridge and Haeckel's human birthplace and transform them into something far more elaborate and fantastical, a sunken continent inhabited by advanced spiritual beings who represented a stage in humanity's mystical evolution. The woman most responsible for this transformation was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian immigrant who became one of the most influential esoteric writers of the 19th century. Blavatsky co-founded the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, creating an organization that would blend elements of Eastern and Western spiritual traditions with scientific-sounding terminology and claims of access to ancient wisdom. Theosophy, as Blavatsky's system came to be known, proposed that behind the visible world of matter lay deeper spiritual realities accessible only to those who had developed appropriate faculties of perception and understanding. Blavatsky was a prolific writer and a charismatic teacher who attracted followers from educated classes in Europe and America. Her magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, was published in 1888 as a massive 2-volume work that claimed to reveal the true history of humanity and the cosmos, based on ancient texts that Blavatsky said she had accessed through psychic means. The Secret Doctrine presented a cosmology and history that drew on Hindu and Buddhist concept, Kabbalistic mysticism, and contemporary scientific ideas, all filtered through Blavatsky's unique interpretive lens and expressed in prose that was by turns grandiose, obscure, and imaginative. Central to The Secret Doctrine was Blavatsky's theory of root races, which proposed that humanity had evolved through 7 distinct stages or races, each more spiritually advanced than the previous one. These were not races in the conventional sense of different groups of modern humans, but rather fundamentally different types of beings that had existed in sequence throughout Earth's history. According to Blavatsky, modern humanity represented the 5th root race, preceded by 4 earlier races that had lived in very different physical and spiritual conditions. The third root race, according to Blavatsky's elaborate mythology, had inhabited a continent she called Lemuria. She explicitly connected her Lemuria to Sclater's scientific hypothesis, claiming that the zoologist's land bridge had actually been home to one of these primordial human root races. But Blavatsky's Lemuria bore little resemblance to a simple biogeographical land bridge. It was, in her account, a vast continent that stretched from the Indian Ocean across much of the Pacific, encompassing Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, Madagascar, and portions of East Africa and South America. The Lemurians themselves, as Blavatsky described them, were beings utterly unlike modern humans. They stood approximately 15 feet tall, with bodies that combined characteristics we would now consider impossible. They were hermaphroditic, capable of reproduction without sexual pairing. They possessed 4 arms, the better to interact with their environment. Their faces were flat and broad, with eyes set far apart that could see not just forward, but to the sides. Some Lemurians, Blavatsky claimed, even had a third eye and the back of their heads, granting them vision in all directions. These physical characteristics were matched by extraordinary mental and spiritual abilities. The Lemurians did not communicate through spoken language as we do, but through a form of telepathy, their thoughts traveling directly from mind to mind without need for words. They possessed psychic abilities that allowed them to manipulate matter and energy in ways that would appear magical to later humans. They could, according to theosophical teachings, walk backward as easily as forward, their alternative anatomy making such movement natural. They reproduced by laying eggs, more like birds or reptiles than mammals, a characteristic that Blavatsky claimed demonstrated their existence at an earlier stage of biological evolution.
The Lemurian continent itself was described as a paradise of lush vegetation and abundant resources, a place where the third root race lived in harmony with nature and pursued spiritual development under the guidance of divine beings. But this paradise was not meant to last. According to the secret doctrine, Lemuria was destroyed by volcanic catastrophes and earthquakes that caused the continent to sink beneath the waves over the course of many thousands of years. The destruction was not instantaneous but gradual, with portions of the land sinking while other parts remained above water, their inhabitants migrating to form the next stage of human evolution. Some Lemurians, Blavatsky taught, survived a cataclysm and went on to become the ancestors of the fourth root race, the Atlanteans, who would inhabit the more familiar continent of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean. Thus, Lemuria became not just a land bridge to explain animal distribution, but a crucial stage in the spiritual evolution of humanity, a necessary precursor to the better-known Atlantis and to our own modern civilization. Blavatsky's account of Lemuria was tremendously influential within theosophical circles and beyond. It provided a framework for understanding human history that seemed to incorporate both scientific concepts like evolution and spiritual teachings about humanity's higher purpose. It explained cultural similarities between distant civilizations as remnants of Lemurian wisdom that had been preserved and passed down through the ages. It gave esoteric seekers a mythological homeland, an ancient source of wisdom that modern humans had lost, but might someday recover through spiritual development. Other theosophists would build upon Blavatsky's foundation, adding their own details and elaborations to the Lemurian narrative. Charles Webster Leadbeater, a prominent theosophist who claimed to possess powers of astral clairvoyance, described traveling back through time using his psychic abilities to observe Lemuria directly. He provided detailed accounts of Lemurian architecture, social organization, and daily life, all supposedly accessed through this form of spiritual time travel.
William Scott Elliot, another theosophist, published books that included elaborate maps of Lemuria at different stages of its existence, showing the continent's gradual submersion as portions sank into the ocean over millions of years. Scott Elliot's maps are particularly notable examples of how pseudoscientific ideas can take on an aura of authority through careful presentation. Printed in color with longitude and latitude lines showing careful delineation between land and sea, these maps looked like legitimate scientific documents. They appeared in books published by respectable publishers and were reproduced in theosophical literature for decades. To the casual observer, they might seem like genuine cartographic reconstructions based on geological evidence. In reality, they were imaginative creations, representing continents that had never existed at times when plate tectonics tells us the Earth's surface looked entirely different. Through the writings of Blavatsky, Leadbeater, Scott Elliot, and other theosophists, Lemuria became firmly established in esoteric and New Age thinking. It appeared in countless books, lectures, and spiritual teachings as an accepted fact, a real place that had existed in humanity's distant past. The concept spread beyond theosophy proper into related spiritual movements, into occult societies, and into the emerging New Age subculture that would flower in the 20th century. Mount Shasta in Northern California became associated with Lemurian refugees, supposedly living inside the mountain, a legend that persists to this day among certain spiritual communities. But while theosophy was transforming Sclater's land bridge into a spiritual homeland for mystic root races, another transformation was about to occur, one that would create an entirely separate lost continent legend. This transformation would be the work of one man whose obsessive research and vivid imagination would give the world Mu, a Pacific continent whose legend would eventually rival and often merge with that of Lemuria. James Churchward was born in England in 1851, the same year as Philip Sclater's birth, and just 3 years before the birth of Augustus Laplanche. Like Laplanche, Churchward would have a varied career that took him across multiple continents and through several professions before he turned his attention to ancient mysteries and lost continents. He served in the British military in India during his youth, worked as a tea planter in Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, and eventually immigrated to the United States in the 1890s, settling in New York. Churchward was by all accounts an intelligent and capable man. He held patents for various types of steel alloys, including armor plating used on ships during World War I. These inventions brought him financial success, allowing him to retire to a comfortable estate on Lake Ononskopamook in Lakeville, Connecticut. It was during this retirement, with time and resources at his disposal, that Churchward turned his considerable energy and determination toward answering questions that had puzzled him since his time in Asia decades earlier. According to Churchward's own account, which has never been independently verified, the foundation for his theories about lost continents had been laid during his military service in India. He claimed that while stationed there, he had befriended a high-ranking priest at an ancient temple, a learned man who revealed to him the existence of certain sacred clay tablets hidden in the temple's vaults. These tablets, Churchward said, were inscribed in a language called Nagamaya, a tongue so ancient and obscure that only 3 people in all of India could read it, and the priest was one of them. Churchward claimed to have convinced the priest to teach him this lost language and to allow him to study the tablets. He said he worked with the priest for years, painstakingly translating the texts inscribed on the sunburnt clay. What he found, according to his account, was nothing less than the true history of humanity, a record of an advanced civilization that had existed tens of thousands of years ago on a vast continent in the Pacific Ocean. This continent, the tablets supposedly revealed, was called Mu, and it had been the motherland of all human civilization, the source from which cultures around the world had originated. The problem with Churchward's story is that no one has ever been able to independently verify any part of it. The temple priest remains unnamed and unidentified. The clay tablets have never been seen by anyone else. The Naga Maya language is unknown to linguistic scholarship. no records exist of Churchward's military service in India, the entire foundation of his theory rests on claims that cannot be checked, evidence that cannot be examined, sources that remain forever inaccessible. This should have raised immediate red flags among scholars and critics, but Churchward's confidence in his own narrative and his skill at marshalling apparent evidence from other sources would allow his theories to gain a following despite these fundamental problems with credibility. Churchward did not publish his theories immediately. He spent decades traveling throughout the Pacific, visiting islands from Hawaii to Easter Island, examining archaeological sites, and collecting what he considered to be evidence supporting the existence of Mu. He studied megalithic structures, examined ancient symbols carved on stones, and interviewed local people about their legends and traditions. Everywhere he looked, he found what he believed to be confirmation of the lost continent's existence, evidence that Mu had been real and that traces of its civilization remained scattered across the Pacific and beyond. In 1926, at the age of 75, Churchward finally published his magnum opus, a book titled The Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man. This work, followed by several sequels in the 1930s, including The Children of Mu and The Sacred Symbols of Mu, laid out Churchward's complete vision of this vanished civilization. The books were popular successes, finding an eager audience among readers fascinated by mysteries of the past and willing to entertain unconventional ideas about human history. According to Churchward's reconstruction, Mu had been immense, far larger than any modern continent except Asia. It stretched east to west for 5,000 miles, from the Marianas Islands in the west to Easter Island in the east. North to south, it measured more than 3,000 miles, reaching from Hawaii in the north to Mangaia in the south. In total area, Churchward claimed Mu covered more territory than South America, occupying nearly half of the Pacific Ocean basin. This vast landmass had been home to 64 million inhabitants, divided into 10 distinct tribes or nations, all united under a single government and sharing a common religion. The civilization of Mu, as Churchward described it, had reached heights of advancement that surpassed even modern society. The Muians possessed profound knowledge of physics and engineering, allowing them to construct massive stone structures with precision that would be difficult to achieve even with contemporary technology. They understood astronomy and had mapped the stars with sophisticated accuracy. They had developed forms of energy that modern science had yet to rediscover. They navigated the oceans in ships capable of traveling vast distances, establishing colonies on distant shores, and spreading their influence around the entire world. But what distinguished the Muians most in Churchward's telling was their spiritual advancement. They lived, he claimed, according to high moral principles, worshiping a single creator deity represented by solar symbols. Their society was peaceful and harmonious, free from the warfare and conflict that plagued later civilizations. They devoted themselves to learning, to art, to the pursuit of knowledge both practical and spiritual. In Churchward's imagination, Mu represented a golden age of human achievement, a time when humanity had been united and guided by wisdom that would later be lost. The inhabitants of Mu themselves were described by Churchward as belonging to what he termed a white race, a characterization that reveals much about the racial attitudes prevalent in his era and the ways in which lost continent theories often serve to advance scientifically unsupported ideas about racial hierarchies that are now recognized as baseless. Churchward asserted that this Muian race was superior to all others, the true source of human civilization and achievement, claims that have been thoroughly rejected by modern anthropology and genetics. He claimed that all the great ancient civilizations, from Egypt to Babylon to the Indus Valley, had been founded by Muian colonists who brought their superior knowledge and culture to less developed peoples around the world. This racially charged narrative was central to the appeal of Mu for many of Churchward's readers. In the early 20th century, when his books were published, theories about racial hierarchies were widespread in Western society, and many people were eager to believe that a white civilization had an ancient and glorious lineage. The idea that a superior white race had once ruled a vast Pacific empire, and that their colonies had brought civilization to the rest of the world, resonated with colonial attitudes and racial prejudices of the time. It allowed readers to see contemporary racial hierarchies as rooted in ancient history, rather than as products of recent conquest and colonization. Churchward placed Mu's flourishing between approximately 50,000 and 12,000 years ago, a time frame that put the continent's existence far deeper into prehistory than recorded history extended. This timing was significant for several reasons. It pushed Mu back before the established chronologies of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other early civilizations, allowing Churchward to claim that Mu had been their predecessor and source. It also placed Mu's existence during a period when archaeological evidence was scarce and human activity difficult to trace, making his claims harder to definitively disprove, even as they lacked positive evidence. The end of Mu, according to Churchward, came approximately 12,000 years ago in a catastrophic series of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. He described the destruction in vivid, apocalyptic terms: the earth splitting open in fiery chasms, mountains of flame rising from the depths, tsunamis sweeping across the land, the very foundations of the continent fracturing and giving way. In the space of a few terrible days and nights, Mu sank beneath the waves, taking with it 64 million people and the accumulated wisdom of tens of thousands of years of civilization. The ocean rushed in to claim 50 million square miles where land had been, leaving only scattered islands as remnants of what had once been a vast and unified continent. Some fortunate few managed to escape, Churchward suggested, fleeing to high mountains or sailing away in ships before the final cataclysm. These survivors carried with them fragments of Muan knowledge and culture, preserving them as best they could in their new homes. It was these refugee populations, Churchward argued, who founded the civilizations we know from ancient history, bringing with them architectural knowledge, religious concepts, and scientific understanding derived from their Muan heritage. Thus, the similarities observers noted between distant ancient cultures, from pyramid building in Egypt and Mesoamerica to solar worship in locations around the world, could be explained not by independent innovation or simple diffusion of ideas, but by their common origin in lost Mu. To support his extraordinary claims about Mu's existence and influence, Churchward marshaled what he presented as extensive evidence from multiple sources around the world. Much of this evidence consisted of symbols and artistic motifs that appeared in various ancient cultures. Churchward had developed a method of interpretation that allowed him to see Muan influence everywhere he looked, finding connections and meanings that no actual scholar of these cultures would recognize. The sun, for instance, appeared as a motif in ancient art from Egypt to Peru, from Babylonia to Polynesia. To Churchward, this commonality proved that all these cultures had inherited solar worship from Mu, where the supreme deity had been represented by the sun. He pointed to the Egyptian god Ra, whose name matched what Churchward claimed was the Rapa Nui, the Easter Island people's word for sun, Ra'a. This seemed to Churchward to establish a direct line of transmission from Mu through Rapa Nui to Egypt. The fact that solar imagery appears in nearly every human culture that has existed as a natural response to the sun's obvious importance for agriculture, warmth, and light did not lead Churchward to question whether a common source was actually necessary to explain these similarities. Birds featured prominently in Churchward's interpretation as well. He saw bird symbols in ancient art as representing the relationship between earth and sky, body and spirit, mortality and transcendence. These bird motifs, appearing in cultures from the Americas to Asia, all traced back, according to Churchward, to original Muan symbolic language. Again, the possibility that birds might independently occur to different cultures as powerful symbols, given their ability to fly and their obvious presence in all inhabited environments, did not seem to warrant consideration in Churchward's system. Churchward paid particular attention to Easter Island, that remote speck of land in the southeastern Pacific that had captured the imagination of Europeans since its discovery by Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen on Easter Sunday, 1722. The island's famous Moai statues, those massive stone figures with their elongated faces and heavy brows, seemed to Churchward to be obvious remnants of Muin civilization. He argued that Easter Island had been one of the high mountain peaks of Mu, remaining above water when the rest of the continent sank, and that the Moai represented the artistic tradition of the lost motherland. The pukao, those cylindrical stone hats or topknots that crowned some of the Moai, particularly fascinated Churchward. He described these as spheres that appeared red from a distance, representing the sun as Ra'ah. Churchward claimed that some pukao were made from red sandstone, a rock type that does not occur naturally on Easter Island. In reality, the pukao are clearly cylindrical rather than spherical, and they're made from red scoria, a volcanic rock native to Easter Island and its Punapau quarry. Churchward saw what he wanted to see, interpreting the evidence to fit his preconceived theory rather than allowing the evidence to shape his understanding. The Ahu platforms on which the Moai rest presented another piece of supposed evidence for Churchward. These carefully constructed stone platforms, which actually served as ceremonial and burial sites in Rapa Nui culture, were described by Churchward as accumulations of cut and dressed stone waiting to be shipped to other parts of the continent for use in building temples and palaces. The fact that the Ahu are clearly finished structures, integral parts of Rapa Nui ceremonial architecture, rather than piles of construction materials, did not penetrate Churchward's interpretive framework. He had decided that Easter Island was a remnant of Mu, and every feature of the island had to be made to fit that narrative. Churchward's interpretation of biblical texts provided another pillar of his claimed evidential structure. He asserted that Moses had been trained by the Na'akal Brotherhood in Egypt, that secret society of Muin origin that had supposedly preserved ancient wisdom through the millennia. The Garden of Eden, according to Churchward's idiosyncratic biblical reinterpretation, had been located not in Mesopotamia, as traditional exegesis and geographical references in Genesis would suggest, but in the Pacific Ocean, on the continent of Mu itself. Various biblical passages, when viewed through Churchward's idiosyncratic lens, revealed hidden references to Mu and its civilization. That these interpretations bore no relationship to any credible biblical scholarship, that they required reading meanings into texts that the original authors clearly never intended, did not concern Churchward or his followers. The Hindu epic Ramayana provided what Churchward considered particularly strong textual evidence. The ancient sage Valmiki, traditional author of the Ramayana, had mentioned the Na'akals coming to Burma from the land of their birth in the east. To Churchward, this clearly referred to Mu, located to the east of Burma in the Pacific Ocean. The fact that the east is a relative direction that could refer to many places, that the Na'akals are not actually mentioned in the Ramayana as it exists in Sanskrit tradition, that Churchward's translation bore no relationship to what the epic actually says, these inconvenient facts were simply ignored or explained away. Throughout his books, Churchward displayed remarkable confidence in his ability to interpret ancient texts and symbols, despite having no formal training in archaeology, linguistics, ancient languages, or any of the academic disciplines that might have equipped him to make such interpretations responsibly. He read meaning into images and texts based on superficial similarities and personal intuition, rather than rigorous comparative analysis. He cherry-picked examples that seemed to support his theory while ignoring the vast body of evidence that contradicted it. He made claims about ancient civilizations that were directly at odds with what actual scholars of those civilizations knew to be true. Most problematically, Churchward's entire edifice rested on evidence that could not be independently verified. The Na'akal tablets he claimed to have seen and translated remained in an unnamed temple, shown to him by an unnamed priest, written in a language unknown to linguistics. When pressed on these details, Churchward would maintain that the tablets existed and that his translations were accurate, but he could never produce the tablets themselves or provide information that would allow others to access them. His entire theory depended on accepting his word that these foundational documents existed and said what he claimed they said. The scholarly response to Churchward's work was, predictably, overwhelmingly negative. Archaeologists, anthropologists, geologists, and historians who actually studied Pacific cultures, ancient civilizations, and Earth history found his theories to be without merit. The evidence he presented either didn't support his conclusions or was based on fundamental misunderstandings of the material. His methods were the opposite of rigorous scholarship, involving selective interpretation of ambiguous symbols, translation of texts he didn't have access to in languages he couldn't read, and construction of elaborate theories on foundations of speculation rather than evidence. But scholarly rejection did not prevent Churchward's books from finding a wide popular audience. The Lost Continent of Mu became a bestseller, spawning sequels and inspiring countless imitators. Readers who lacked the specialized knowledge to evaluate his claims found the books compelling, the vision of ancient Mu romantic and appealing. The idea that humanity had once been united in a single glorious civilization, that we had achieved great heights in the distant past, only to lose that wisdom through catastrophe, resonated with deep psychological needs and cultural narratives about golden ages and falls from grace. While Churchward's theories about Mu were capturing public imagination, the actual science of geology was advancing in ways that would make the existence of Mu or any similar lost Pacific continent utterly impossible to sustain as a serious hypothesis. The early 20th century saw revolutionary changes in our understanding of how the Earth's surface works, changes that would completely transform geology and render obsolete the kinds of land bridge and sunken continent theories that had seemed plausible in the 19th century. The breakthrough came through the persistent work of Alfred Wegener, that German meteorologist who had proposed in 1912 that continents actually moved across the Earth's surface over geological time. Wegener's theory of continental drift, initially rejected by most geologists, gradually gained support as evidence accumulated. The fit between continental coastlines, particularly the remarkable match between the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa, suggested these land masses had once been joined. Identical rock formations and fossil species appeared on continents, now separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Ancient glacial deposits indicated that land masses now in tropical regions had once been located near the poles. But the mechanism driving continental movement remained mysterious until the 1950s and 60s, when new technologies developed during World War II allowed scientists to study the ocean floors in unprecedented detail. Sonar mapping revealed vast underwater mountain ranges running down the centers of ocean basins. These mid-ocean ridges, as they came to be called, showed signs of intense geological activity, with earthquakes concentrated along their lengths and high heat flow emanating from their crests. Study of magnetic patterns in rocks on the ocean floor revealed striking symmetric stripes running parallel to the mid-ocean ridges. These stripes represented rocks that had formed at different times and recorded different orientations of the Earth's magnetic field, which periodically reverses polarity. The pattern of magnetic stripes indicated that new ocean floor was constantly being created at the mid-ocean ridges, with older rocks pushed away from the ridges as new material welled up from below. This process, called seafloor spreading, provided the missing mechanism for continental drift. Dating of ocean floor rocks confirmed the seafloor spreading hypothesis and revealed something startling. The ocean floors were young compared to the continents. While continental rocks dated back billions of years, ocean floor rocks were at most a few 100 million years old, and the youngest rocks lay along the mid-ocean ridges, while the oldest were found near the continents. This indicated that ocean floors were constantly being renewed, with old oceanic crust sinking back into the Earth's interior at deep ocean trenches, while new crust formed at the ridges. By the mid-1960s, these observations had coalesced into the theory of plate tectonics. a comprehensive framework that explained how the Earth's outer layer, the lithosphere, is broken into large, rigid plates that move relative to each other. These plates carry both continents and ocean floors, driven by convection currents in the hot, slowly flowing mantle below. Where plates diverge, new oceanic crust forms at mid-ocean ridges. Where plates converge, one plate slides beneath the other in a process called subduction, with the descending plate melting back into the mantle. Where plates slide past each other, earthquakes mark the boundaries of their interaction. Plate tectonics revolutionized earth science, providing a unifying theory that explained mountain building, earthquake distribution, volcanic activity, and the locations of ore deposits. It vindicated Wagner's continental drift and provided the mechanism he had lacked. Most importantly for our story, it rendered impossible the kind of sunken continent theories that had seemed plausible in the 19th century. Continents could not simply sink beneath the oceans. The physics of plate tectonics made such an event impossible. The reason lies in the composition and density of continental and oceanic crust. Continental crust is composed primarily of relatively light rocks, rich in silicon and aluminum, minerals that geologists collectively call sial. Oceanic crust, by contrast, consists of denser rocks, rich in silicon and magnesium, called sima. This density difference is fundamental to how plate tectonics works. Oceanic crust, being denser, can subduct beneath continental crust or beneath other oceanic plates, sinking back into the mantle where it melts. But continental crust is too light, too buoyant to subduct. It cannot sink into the denser material beneath it any more than a piece of wood can spontaneously sink in water. When continental plates collide, they crumple and fold, building mountain ranges like the Himalayas, where the Indian subcontinent is pushing into Asia. The continental material stacks up, creates elevated terrain, but it does not disappear beneath the surface. This is why continental rocks can be billions of years old, while ocean floor rocks are relatively young. Continents persist, floating on the denser material beneath them, accumulating layer upon layer of sediment and volcanic rock over geological time. Ocean floors, meanwhile, are constantly recycled, created at mid-ocean ridges and consumed at subduction zones in a cycle that takes roughly 200 million years to complete. For a continent the size Churchward claimed for Mu to have existed, there would need to be a corresponding mass of continental crustal material. This material cannot simply disappear. If 50 million square miles of continental crust had sunk 12,000 years ago, as Churchward claimed, that enormous mass of relatively light rock would have to have gone somewhere.
It would either be piled up somewhere else, creating mountain ranges of unprecedented scale, or it would still be on the ocean floor, creating a massive submerged plateau. Neither scenario matches the reality of the Pacific Ocean basin.
The Pacific Ocean floor is not littered with continental debris. It consists of oceanic crust, that denser basaltic rock that forms at mid-ocean ridges and slowly spreads outward. The ocean is deep, averaging about 4,000 meters, precisely because it is floored with dense oceanic crust that sits low in relation to the lighter continental crust. Mapping of the Pacific seafloor, now complete in remarkable detail, shows a floor characterized by volcanic seamounts, oceanic plateaus, and deep trenches, all features consistent with oceanic crust and plate tectonic processes. There is no submerged continent, no vast plateau of sunken continental material, nothing that would indicate a landmass the size Churchward claimed had ever existed in this location. The volcanic islands that dot the Pacific present another line of evidence against the existence of Mu. These islands, from Hawaii to Tahiti to the Galapagos, are not the mountain peaks of a sunken continent, as Churchward and others have claimed. They are volcanic structures built up from the ocean floor by repeated eruptions over millions of years. Many formed over hot spots, stationary plumes of magma rising from deep in the mantle, as tectonic plates passed overhead. The chain of Hawaiian Islands, for instance, represents a progression of volcanoes formed as the Pacific Plate moved northwest over the Hawaiian hotspot, with the oldest islands to the northwest and the youngest, the Big Island of Hawaii, where volcanic activity continues today, to the southeast. These volcanic islands are surrounded by very deep water. The ocean floor drops steeply away from their shores, descending thousands of meters within short distances. If the islands were peaks of a sunken continent, we would expect to find submerged continental shelves around them, shallow areas of continental crust extending from the visible land before dropping off to oceanic depths. We would expect to find sedimentary rocks, the limestone and sandstone that form on continental margins. We would expect the kinds of geological features associated with continental environments. We find none of these things. The islands are clearly volcanic in origin, built up from the ocean floor rather than remnants of submerged continental landmass. Easter Island serves as an excellent example of why the sunken continent theory cannot work. This small triangular island, the easternmost point of Polynesia, lies more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass. The ocean surrounding it is extremely deep, plunging to 3,000 meters at a distance of just 30 kilometers from shore. The island itself is volcanic, formed by a series of eruptions from 3 main volcanoes now extinct. Every rock on the island is volcanic in origin, the product of lava flows and volcanic ash accumulation. There is no sandstone, no limestone, none of the sedimentary rocks that would be expected if the island had once been part of a larger continental landmass. In the 1930s, the French anthropologist Alfred Métraux visited Easter Island and made careful observations of the Moai platforms and their relationship to the island's geography. He noted that the Ahu platforms were concentrated along the current coastline of the island, following the shore as it existed when the structures were built. If Easter Island had been the mountain peak of a much larger landmass that subsequently sank, we would expect the Ahu to be scattered across the island interior, their positions making sense only when we imagine a vanished coastal plain that no longer exists. Instead, the Ahu are positioned exactly where we would expect them if the island had always been roughly its current size and shape, with communities building their ceremonial structures along the accessible shores. Pierre Lodi, a French naval officer and novelist who visited Easter Island in the 1870s, had reported seeing what appeared to be a paved road extending from the island into the sea, which he romantically interpreted as evidence of a submerged land. Later investigation revealed that this supposed triumphal road was actually a natural lava flow, the solidified path of molten rock that had flowed from one of the island's volcanoes down to the sea. The regular appearance of the lava surface, broken into polygonal blocks by cooling and contraction, had created an illusion of human construction. But geological examination left no doubt that this was a natural feature, not the remnant of some ancient highway connecting Easter Island to a vanished continent. The coral atolls that dot the Pacific provide yet another line of evidence against recent continental submersion. These ring-shaped reefs, surrounding lagoons where volcanic islands once stood, form through a process that takes millions of years. As volcanic islands slowly subside, sinking gradually back into the ocean floor under their own weight, coral reefs continue to grow upward, maintaining their position near the surface where sunlight allows the coral organisms to thrive. Eventually, the volcanic island disappears entirely beneath the lagoon, leaving only the coral reef as a ring marking where land once existed. This process is slow and continuous, requiring stable conditions over immense timescales. The presence of numerous atolls in the Pacific, at various stages of this progression, indicates that the ocean basin has been stable for millions of years, undisturbed by any catastrophic sinking of continental landmasses. The rate of plate tectonics movement provides yet another constraint on continental change. Tectonic plates move at rates measured in centimeters per year, typically between 2 and 10 centimeters annually. This is roughly the rate at which human fingernails grow, a fact that scientists often cite to help people grasp the pace of these movements. At such rates, significant changes in continental positions require millions of years to accumulate. The idea that 50 million square miles of continental crust could sink in the space of a few days or even a few thousand years, as catastrophist theories of Mu's destruction require, violates everything we understand about how the Earth's crust behaves. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, dramatic though they may be, involve relatively small-scale crustal movements. Even the most powerful earthquakes shift the crust by only a few meters. The most massive volcanic eruptions deposit relatively thin layers of new rock. For continents to move the distances required to create and destroy landmasses on Mu's supposed scale would require forces and time spans far beyond anything possible in recent geological history. The energy required to submerge 50 million square miles of continental crust would be many orders of magnitude greater than the total seismic and volcanic energy released in all of recorded human history combined. The geological impossibility of Mu does not mean that the Pacific lacks fascinating geological history or that sea levels have not changed over time. During ice ages, when vast amounts of water were locked up in continental glaciers, sea levels dropped significantly, exposing land that is now submerged. In Southeast Asia, a large continental shelf, called Sundaland, was exposed during the last ice age, creating a landmass that connected many of the islands of Indonesia and Malaysia. This was a real submerged landmass, not a myth, and it played an important role in human migration, serving as a stepping stone for the peopling of Australia and the Pacific Islands. But Sundaland was not a continent that suddenly sank. It was a continental shelf, an extension of the Asian continent that was alternately exposed and submerged as ice ages came and went and sea levels rose and fell accordingly. The process was gradual, taking thousands of years as glaciers advanced and retreated. And even at its greatest extent during maximum ice age glaciation, Sundaland was far smaller than Churchward's Mu and located in entirely the wrong part of the Pacific, in the Western Ocean near Asia, rather than in the Central and Eastern Pacific where Mu was supposed to have existed. In 2013, geologists announced the discovery of evidence for another submerged landmass in the Indian Ocean, which they named Mauritius. Fragments of ancient continental rock, including zircon crystals dating back 3 billion years, were found in lava from the island of Mauritius, an island that itself formed only 2 million years ago. This indicated that the lava had incorporated older continental material as it rose from the mantle, material from a microcontinent that had broken away from Madagascar and been submerged when the Indian Ocean basin opened up through plate tectonic processes. Mauritius had broken away from Madagascar as India drifted northward, eventually sinking beneath the waves approximately 84 million years ago. Mauritius' discovery might seem to vindicate the lost continent theorists, and some promoters of Lemuria and Mu have indeed seized upon it as validation. But Mauritia actually demonstrates why Mu and similar recent sunken continents cannot be real. Mauritia sank 84 million years ago, not 12,000 years ago, as part of the gradual process of continental breakup and ocean basin formation driven by plate tectonics. It was a small microcontinent, not a massive landmass covering half an ocean. And it sank in the Indian Ocean, where Philip Sclair had originally proposed Lemuria for legitimate scientific reasons, not in the Pacific, where Churchwood claimed Mu had existed. Mauritia represents the kind of gradual geological process that actually occurs, not the catastrophic recent submersion that lost continent myths require. Perhaps no single place on Earth has been more central to theories about Mu and lost Pacific civilizations than Easter Island, that remote speck of land that rises from the southeastern Pacific like a monument to both human ingenuity and human imagination. Known to its indigenous inhabitants as Rapa Nui, this small volcanic island has captured the fascination of explorers, archaeologists, and seekers of mysteries since Europeans first encountered it in the early 18th century. The massive stone statues that dot its landscape, those imposing figures with their elongated features and heavy brows, have inspired countless theories about who created them, how they were made, and what they signify. And because the island's remoteness and the impressiveness of its archaeological remains seem to demand extraordinary explanations, it has become a magnet for speculation about lost continents, ancient astronauts, and vanished super-civilizations. The truth about Easter Island and its Moai statues is in many ways more remarkable than the myths that have accumulated around them, a testament to human ingenuity, cultural sophistication, and the ability of small communities to accomplish great works through organization and persistence. But to appreciate this truth, we must set aside the romantic notion that these monuments required assistance from sunken continents or extraterrestrial visitors, and instead examine what archaeology, anthropology, and the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people themselves tell us about this extraordinary place. Easter Island is small, covering only about 64 square miles of land, roughly the size of a small city. It is also extremely remote, lying more than 2,000 miles west of Chile, the mainland nation that now governs it, and nearly 1,400 miles from Pitcairn Island, its nearest inhabited neighbor. This isolation is almost total. No other populated land lies within 1,000 miles in most directions. The island's very existence in such isolation seems improbable, as though it had been placed there deliberately to test the limits of human navigation and settlement. The island is volcanic in origin, formed by 3 main volcanoes that erupted from the ocean floor over the course of several 100,000 years. The largest of these, Ranokau, dominates the southwestern corner of the island, its crater holding a freshwater lake that provided a crucial resource for the island's inhabitants. Rano Haraku, a smaller volcano on the island's eastern side, would become even more significant, its interior and exterior slopes serving as the quarry from which nearly all of the moai were carved. The island's highest point, Mount Derevaka, rises just over 1,600 feet above sea level, high enough to be visible from a great distance at sea, but modest compared to the mountains of continental landscapes. When the first Polynesian voyagers reached Easter Island, they found a place quite different from the relatively barren landscape that greets visitors today. The island was covered with forests, particularly a species of palm tree that grew to impressive sizes, some reaching 60 feet or more in height. These forests provided timber for construction, fuel for fires, and resources for building the canoes that allowed the islanders to fish in the surrounding waters. The forests also hosted several species of land birds found nowhere else on Earth, creatures that had evolved in isolation on this remote island over hundreds of thousands of years. The question of when humans first reached Easter Island has been the subject of considerable archaeological debate, with dates proposed ranging from as early as the 4th century CE to as late as the 13th century. Recent archaeological work using refined radiocarbon dating techniques and careful stratigraphic analysis has converged on a settlement date sometime around 1200 to 1400 CE, making Easter Island one of the last places on Earth to be settled by humans. This relatively recent colonization stands in stark contrast to Churchward's claims that the island had been inhabited continuously since the sinking of Mu 12,000 years ago. The settlers who reached Easter Island were Polynesians, almost certainly coming from the Marquesas Islands, an archipelago lying about 2,000 miles to the northwest. This journey represents one of the most impressive feats of maritime navigation in human history.
The Polynesians who ventured across such vast ocean distances were master navigators, using their knowledge of stars, wave patterns, cloud formations, and bird behavior to find tiny islands scattered across the world's largest ocean. They traveled in double-hulled canoes capable of carrying people, plants, animals, and supplies sufficient to establish new settlements on previously uninhabited islands. Their navigation was so sophisticated that modern experimental archaeology has demonstrated that Polynesian wayfinding techniques could indeed allow voyagers to locate specific islands thousands of miles away and return to them deliberately. The colonists brought with them the plants and animals they needed to survive: chickens for protein, sweet potatoes for carbohydrates, banana plants, taro, and sugarcane. The sweet potato is particularly interesting because it originated in South America, not in the Pacific Islands, indicating that at some point Polynesians had reached the South American coast, obtained sweet potatoes, and brought them back to the Pacific Islands where they became a staple crop. This contact between Polynesians and South America, which likely occurred several centuries before European exploration of the Pacific, demonstrates the range and capability of Polynesian voyagers without requiring any sunken continents to explain it. On Easter Island, the Polynesian settlers established a society organized around kinship groups and chieftainship. According to Rapa Nui oral traditions recorded by European visitors in the 19th century, the island was divided among several clans descended from the original colonizing chief, Hotumatua, whose name and lineage were carefully preserved in oral history. Each clan had its own territory along the coast and inland, with the island's resources distributed among these competing but related groups. The social structure was hierarchical, with chiefs and priests holding positions of authority, and common people providing labor for collective projects. The most visible of these collective projects, the ones that would secure Easter Island's place in archaeological history and in the popular imagination, were the moai. These massive stone statues, carved from volcanic tuff at the quarry of Rano Raraku, represent one of humanity's most impressive achievements in stoneworking and engineering. 887 moai have been catalogued on the island, ranging in height from a few feet to more than 30 feet, with weights reaching 80 tons for the largest completed statues. The statues share a distinctive style: elongated faces with prominent brows, long ears, narrow noses, and pursed lips. Most stand with their hands positioned on their stomachs, fingers meeting in a formal gesture. The backs of many are covered with intricate petroglyphs, designs and symbols that likely held ritual or genealogical significance. The moai were not randomly distributed across the island, but were erected on ceremonial platforms called ahu, stone structures built with careful attention to fitting and alignment. These ahu served as sacred sites and burial places, connecting the living community to their deceased ancestors. The moai themselves, according to the understanding of Rapa Nui culture developed by archaeologists working with Rapa Nui cultural practitioners, represented specific ancestors, important chiefs, whose spiritual power or mana continued to watch over and protect their descendants. When a chief died, his lineage might commission a moai to be carved and erected on the ahu associated with their clan, creating a stone embodiment of the ancestors' continuing presence.
The creation of these statues required remarkable organization and skill. Teams of carvers worked in the quarry at Rano-Raraku, using stone tools made from harder basalt to chip away at the volcanic tuff. The carving process began with the statue's face and front, worked to final form while the figure remained partially attached to the quarry wall. Only when the front and sides were complete would carvers begin the delicate process of separating the statue from the living rock, undercutting it and working it free. This took time and coordination, with multiple carvers working simultaneously on a single statue, their efforts guided by specialists who understood the stone and its properties. Once freed from the quarry, the moai had to be transported to their destinations, sometimes many miles away across the island's rugged terrain. How this was accomplished has been the subject of much speculation and experimentation. The Rapa Nui themselves, in their oral traditions, said that the moai walked to their destinations, an account that many outsiders initially dismissed as mythological. But experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the Rapa Nui's description may have been more literal than metaphorical. By using ropes attached to the statue's head and base and carefully rocking it forward in a walking motion, teams of people can indeed make the statues appear to walk, moving them forward through a controlled process of tilting and pivoting. This walking technique requires skill and coordination, but not the kind of lost super technology that alternative theories have proposed. It uses the weight and shape of the statue itself, taking advantage of the physics of balance and leverage rather than fighting against them. Experimental replications have successfully moved moai-sized replicas considerable distances using this method, demonstrating that Polynesian engineering knowledge and community organization were entirely sufficient to accomplish what Churchward and others have claimed required the advanced civilization of Mu.
The peak period of moai carving appears to have been between approximately 1250 and 1500 CE, a span of about 250 years, when Rapa Nui society was able to devote significant resources to this monumental sculpture program. During this time, clan groups competed with each other to create larger and more impressive moai, each clan seeking to honor their ancestors and demonstrate their prestige through their monuments. This competition drove the steady increase in statue size, with later moai reaching heights and weights that pushed the limits of what could be carved, transported, and erected. But this intensive period of moai building came at environmental costs to the island's ecosystem. The forests that had covered Easter Island when humans first arrived were gradually cleared, trees cut down for various purposes, including, based on archaeological evidence and experimental studies, the transportation and erection of moai. The large palm trees that once grew on the island disappeared entirely. The exact causes of this deforestation remain debated by scholars, with factors potentially including human timber harvesting, the impact of Polynesian rats that arrived with human colonists and consumed palm seeds, and possible climate changes. Without the forest cover, the island's thin soil began to erode. Agriculture became more difficult as the soil quality declined and the climate seemed to become drier. The seabirds that had nested on the island in large numbers, a crucial source of protein, were hunted heavily and their populations crashed. By the time European explorers first encountered Easter Island in the 18th century, the island had undergone significant changes from its condition at initial human settlement. The forests were gone, replaced by grassland. Many of the moai had been toppled from their ahu platforms, lying face down in the grass or broken into pieces. The population had declined from what some estimates suggest may have been as high as 10 or 15,000 at the civilization's peak, to only a few thousand people living in more modest circumstances than their ancestors. Jacob Rajaveen, the Dutch navigator who reached the island on Easter Sunday 1722, giving it the name by which it would become known to Europeans, reported seeing some moai still standing on their platforms, while others had been knocked down. The island's inhabitants numbered, by his estimate, around 3,000 people who lived in modest, thatched houses and cultivated small gardens.
They paddled out to the Dutch ships in small, poorly made canoes that seemed barely seaworthy, a stark contrast to the magnificent ocean-going vessels that had brought their ancestors to the island centuries earlier. Roggeveen and his men, despite having no common language with the Rapa Nui and spending only a single day on the island, felt confident in making sweeping judgments about the people they encountered, judgments that would unfortunately color European perceptions of Easter Island for centuries to come. Subsequent European visitors in the late 18th and early 19th centuries noted further decline in the island's conditions and population. By the 1860s, the island had suffered catastrophic depopulation from slave raids, particularly a devastating raid by Peruvian vessels in 1862 that carried off more than 1,500 Rapa Nui, including most of the island's chiefs, priests, and literate members of society. Those taken were forced to work in horrific conditions on Guano Islands and in mines on the South American mainland, where most died. Of the roughly 100 who eventually were repatriated after international protest, only 15 survived the journey home, and they brought smallpox with them, which ravaged the already diminished population. By the 1870s, the Rapa Nui population had fallen to just over 100 individuals. This demographic collapse meant that much of the traditional knowledge of Rapa Nui culture was lost. The Rongo-Rongo script, a system of glyphs carved on wooden tablets that may have represented a genuine writing system, could no longer be read by anyone on the island after the slave raids removed those who had been trained in its interpretation. The oral traditions were disrupted, with key knowledge holders dead or displaced. When researchers and missionaries arrived to document Rapa Nui culture, they found a society traumatized by recent catastrophes and struggling to maintain connection with its past. It was in this context of disrupted traditions and fragmentary knowledge that the idea of Easter Island as a remnant of a lost continent found fertile ground. The impressive moai, standing as they did on this tiny, remote island, seemed to European observers to require some extraordinary explanation. How could such a small population on such an isolated island have created these monuments? The assumption, rooted in colonial prejudices about the capabilities of Pacific Islander peoples, was that they could not have, that some other explanation must be found. If not a lost continent like Mu, then perhaps ancient astronauts or some other external source of advanced knowledge. These assumptions did profound disservice to the actual achievements of Rapa Nui culture and to Polynesian civilization more broadly. The moai were not evidence of lost continents or extraterrestrial intervention. They were the products of a sophisticated society that had developed over centuries on Easter Island, building on the already impressive seafaring and stoneworking traditions that Polynesians had brought with them from elsewhere in the Pacific. The engineering knowledge required to create and transport the moai was remarkable, but it was knowledge that humans possessed and applied through ingenuity, experimentation, and collective effort, not knowledge inherited from some vanished super-civilization. Modern archaeological work on Easter Island, conducted with far more rigorous methods than the speculative theorizing of Churchward and his predecessors, has painted a rich picture of Rapa Nui culture that requires no appeal to lost continents. The moai quarry at Rano Raraku, with its hundreds of statues in various stages of completion, provides a detailed record of the carving process. Tool marks on the statues and on the quarry walls show exactly how the work was done. Abandoned statues reveal where and how carvers made mistakes or encountered flaws in the stone that forced them to abandon their work. The logistics of moving statues can be inferred from the distributions of abandoned moai along transport routes and from the features of the ahu platforms designed to receive them. The oral traditions of the Rapa Nui themselves, when approached with respect and properly contextualized, provide invaluable information about the meaning and purpose of the moai and ahu. Rapa Nui cultural practitioners and historians working with archaeologists have helped develop our understanding of these monuments as ancestral representations, as focal points for clan identity and cohesion, as embodiments of spiritual power that connected the living to the dead and to the natural forces that governed island life. This understanding, grounded in Rapa Nui perspectives and supported by archaeological evidence, provides a coherent and culturally meaningful interpretation of the monuments that respects the sophistication of the people who created them. Yet, despite the wealth of evidence for Easter Island's true history, despite the archaeological work that has documented Polynesian settlement and the development of Rapa Nui culture in detail, the island continues to be invoked in theories about lost continents and ancient mysteries. Mu and Lemuria remain associated with Easter Island in popular imagination, the Moai still cited as evidence for vanished civilizations and hidden knowledge. This persistence reveals something important about why lost continent theories endure despite their scientific impossibility. The appeal of Mu and similar lost continent theories lies not in their evidential support, which is non-existent, but in their psychological and cultural functions. They offer a narrative of lost greatness, of human civilization having achieved heights in the distant past that were then catastrophically lost, leaving only scattered remnants and corrupted memories. This narrative has deep roots in human culture, appearing in myths and legends from around the world, from the biblical flood to various creation stories that describe previous worlds that were destroyed before the current one came into being. Lost continent theories also offer a framework for explaining cultural similarities between distant civilizations without acknowledging the independent inventive capacity of different human societies. Before modern archaeology and anthropology developed sophisticated understandings of cultural diffusion, trade networks, and independent innovation, it seemed mysterious that different societies would develop similar technologies, build similar structures, or create similar artistic motifs. Lost continents provided a simple explanation. These similarities resulted from a common source, an ancient motherland from which all civilizations descended or were influenced. This explanation had particular appeal in colonial contexts, where it could be used to suggest that indigenous achievements actually derived from more advanced civilizations, often racially coded as white or Western in origin. The story of Mu took on additional life as it spread beyond Churchward's original books into popular culture. In the pulp fiction magazines and adventure stories of the early and mid-20th century, Mu appeared regularly as a setting for fantastic tales. Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, set some of his stories about the hero Kul in a world where Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu all existed as competing civilizations in an age before recorded history. H.P. Lovecraft, the influential horror writer, incorporated references to Lemuria and sunken Pacific lands into his Cthulhu mythos, where they served as locations of ancient alien civilizations and forbidden knowledge. These fictional treatments of Mu and Lemuria, while not claiming to be factual, reinforced the cultural presence of these lost continents and introduced them to readers who might never have encountered Churchward's or Blavatsky's work. The line between entertaining fiction and pseudo-historical speculation became blurred, with ideas moving freely between the two domains. Comic books, radio serials, and later television shows and films would continue to mine the lost continent concept for dramatic and exotic settings, each iteration adding new layers to the mythology and further embedding these ideas in popular consciousness. In the 1930s, an unexpected but brief interest in Mu's cultural profile came from Turkey. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder and first president of the Republic of Turkey, encountered Churchward's theories as part of his broader efforts to investigate Turkish history and origins. Historical accounts suggest Ataturk examined the claims about Mu as a possible primordial homeland for Turkic peoples, though some historians debate the depth of his engagement with these ideas. A proposal to establish a department for the study of the Mu language at Ankara University was discussed, but never implemented, and Turkish scholarship continued to focus on credible research into actual Turkic history and linguistics, rather than pursuing Churchward's unsubstantiated claims. But in the United States, particularly in California, Mu and Lemuria found an enduring home in New Age and alternative spirituality movements. Mount Shasta, a massive volcanic peak in Northern California, became associated with supposed Lemurian refugees living in or inside the mountain. This belief appears to have originated with Frederick Spencer Oliver's 1894 novel, A Dweller on Two Planets, which presented a fictional narrative of survivors from a sunken continent living within Mount Shasta. Though written as a novel, the book was framed as channeled revelation, with the author claiming to have received the text through automatic writing, guided by spiritual entities, blurring the line between fiction and claimed spiritual truth. In the 1930s, Guy Warren Ballard expanded on these ideas when he founded the IAM activity, a religious movement that incorporated Mount Shasta's supposed Lemurian inhabitants into its mythology. Ballard claimed to have encountered a figure called the Ascended Master Saint Germain on the slopes of Mount Shasta, who taught him about Lemuria and its survivors. The IAM activity promoted the idea that Lemurians were tall, white-robed, spiritual beings who occasionally ventured from their hidden city inside the mountain, and that they possessed ancient wisdom and supernatural powers. These beliefs, though dismissed by mainstream scholarship and by indigenous peoples of the Mount Shasta region, who found them culturally appropriative and disrespectful, took root in the local culture and tourist economy. Mount Shasta became a destination for spiritual seekers, New Age practitioners, and those interested in what they perceived as sacred sites and earth mysteries. Gift shops sold crystals and books about Lemuria. Tour guides offered excursions to spots supposedly associated with Lemurian energy. The mountain acquired a reputation as a power spot, a place where the veil between material and spiritual realities was thin. This commercialization and spiritualization of Mu and Lemuria demonstrates how these myths can take on lives of their own, becoming self-perpetuating through economic and social structures, even as their original claims are thoroughly debunked. The truth or falsehood of Mu's existence becomes almost irrelevant when belief in Mu serves other functions, providing a sense of connection to ancient wisdom, offering identity and community to believers, supporting local economies through mystical tourism, or simply providing entertaining stories and speculative frameworks for imaginative thinking. Modern archaeology and oceanography have continued to explore the Pacific, uncovering real wonders that require no appeal to sunken continents or lost supercivilizations. The ancient city of Non Madol in Micronesia, built on artificial islands constructed from massive basalt boulders, represents an extraordinary achievement of Pacific Islander engineering. Built between the 11th and 13th centuries, Non Madol served as the ceremonial and political center of the Saudoler dynasty, which unified the island of Pohnpei under centralized rule. The city's canal system, stone structures, and sophisticated construction demonstrate the advanced capabilities of Micronesian civilization without requiring any explanation involving Mu or Lemuria. The underwater formations at Yonaguni off the coast of Japan have attracted attention from those seeking evidence of lost civilizations. These stepped formations, discovered in the 1980s by divers exploring the area, feature what appear to be right angles, flat surfaces, and geometric shapes that some interpreters have claimed must be artificial. However, mainstream geologists who have examined the site have concluded that the formations are natural, the product of irregular fracturing patterns in the local sandstone that have been sculpted by water currents and tectonic activity into shapes that superficially resemble constructed features. The fact that similar formations exist elsewhere on Yonaguni, above water, where they are demonstrably natural, supports the geological interpretation over claims of ancient human construction. The discovery of Mauritia in 2013, that microcontinent that sank in the Indian Ocean 84 million years ago, demonstrates that serious geological research does sometimes reveal previously unknown landmasses. But Mauritius' discovery actually undercuts rather than supports lost continent myths, because it shows what a real submerged landmass looks like in the geological record, and how different that is from what Churchward and others claimed for Mu. Mauritius sank gradually over millions of years as part of plate tectonic processes, leaving fragments of continental rock incorporated into later volcanic formations. It was not suddenly destroyed in catastrophic volcanic eruptions 12,000 years ago, and it did not leave behind a scatter of islands that were once mountaintops of a unified continent. Legitimate archaeological research in the Pacific continues to reveal the remarkable achievements of Polynesian and other Pacific Islander civilizations. The navigation techniques that allowed Polynesians to colonize islands across the world's largest ocean represent one of humanity's most impressive technological and intellectual achievements. Recent experimental archaeology, including the building and sailing of replica Polynesian voyaging canoes, has demonstrated that traditional navigation methods, using stars, wave patterns, and bird behavior, could indeed allow navigators to find tiny islands thousands of miles away and return to them deliberately. DNA studies of Pacific Islander populations have traced the routes and timing of human migrations across the Pacific with increasing precision. These studies confirm what oral traditions and archaeological evidence suggest, that Polynesian peoples originated in Southeast Asia, moved through near Oceania into the Central Pacific, and then spread to the far reaches of Polynesia, including Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, over the course of several thousand years. The genetic evidence shows no sign of any mysterious lost race or ancient supercivilization, but rather the normal patterns of human migration, population expansion, and adaptation to new environments. Linguistic research tracking the evolution and spread of Austronesian languages provides another line of evidence for Pacific settlement patterns. The relationships between languages spoken across the Pacific can be mapped like family trees, showing how populations split and migrated, carrying their languages with them, and seeing those languages evolve in isolation into new forms. This linguistic evidence, like the genetic evidence, supports a narrative of gradual expansion and cultural diversification, not sudden dispersion from a destroyed motherland. Yet, for all the scientific evidence against Mu, for all the archaeological work demonstrating the true achievements of Pacific civilizations, the legend persists. Websites devoted to ancient mysteries still feature Mu prominently. Books claiming to reveal the truth about lost continents continue to be published and to find readers. Television programs exploring unexplained phenomena treat Mu as a legitimate possibility worthy of investigation. The scientific refutation of these ideas does not prevent them from circulating, because they are not really scientific hypotheses subject to evidence and revision, but rather cultural narratives that serve psychological and social needs. It is worth comparing the story of Mu to that of Atlantis, the more famous lost continent, whose legend has overshadowed its Pacific rival in the popular imagination. Both represent civilizations supposedly advanced beyond their time. Both are claimed to have sunk catastrophically beneath the waves. Both are invoked to explain cultural similarities between ancient civilizations. Yet Atlantis has maintained a higher profile in Western culture, appearing more frequently in literature, film, and popular discourse. The reasons for this disparity reveal something about how geographic and cultural proximity shape which myths gain traction. Atlantis has the advantage of ancient literary roots. Plato, one of the most influential philosophers in Western tradition, wrote about Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias in the 4th century BCE. While scholars recognize that Plato's account was likely a philosophical fable rather than historical record, the fact that it appears in texts that have been continuously studied and revered for over 2,000 years gives Atlantis a cultural authority that Mu, invented whole cloth in the 20th century, cannot match. Plato's description was brief and served a moral purpose in his philosophical argument, but it was detailed enough to fire the imagination. An island empire in the Atlantic Ocean, technologically advanced, ultimately destroyed by the gods as punishment for hubris and aggression. The location of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, closer to Europe and more familiar to Western civilization, also contributed to its enduring appeal. The Atlantic was the ocean Europeans knew, the ocean they crossed to reach the Americas, the ocean that connected the old world to the new. A lost civilization in these waters seemed more immediate, more relevant to European and later American audiences than one supposedly located in the distant Pacific. The very name Atlantic, traditionally associated with the legend of Atlas, who held up the sky in Greek mythology, created a connection between the ocean and ancient myth that the Pacific lacked. Mu, by contrast, was located in an ocean that remained largely mysterious to Western audiences well into the 20th century. The Pacific was vast and remote, its islands scattered and unfamiliar. Until 20th century aviation made Pacific travel more accessible, the ocean represented a frontier that few Europeans or Americans had experienced directly. Lost continents in the Pacific, while exotic and intriguing, lacked the immediate resonance of Atlantis, situated in more familiar waters. The evidential basis for the two legends also differs significantly, though neither has legitimate archaeological support. Atlantis at least derives from an ancient text by Plato, allowing scholars to debate the philosopher's intentions and possible historical inspirations, if any. Some researchers have suggested that the Atlantis story might have been inspired by real events, such as the Minoan civilization's disruption when the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, experienced a massive eruption in the 2nd millennium BCE. While this interpretation is contested, and most scholars view Atlantis as purely a philosophical fiction created by Plato for didactic purposes, the presence of an ancient textual foundation gives Atlantis a type of historical connection that Mu entirely lacks. Mu's foundation, by contrast, rests entirely on churchwards claims about tablets no one else has seen, written in a language no linguist recognizes, making assertions that contradict everything modern science understands about Pacific geology and human history. Where Atlantis might charitably be viewed as a philosophical allegory or a garbled memory of real historical events, Mu is simply fabricated, an invention of 20th century pseudo-archaeology, with no ancient textual support and no geological plausibility. Both legends has been incorporated into the ancient astronaut theories, popularized by writers like Eric von Daniken in the late 20th century. These theories, which proposed that extraterrestrial visitors influenced or directed human civilization in ancient times, often cite Atlantis and Mu as examples of advanced ancient civilizations whose technology supposedly exceeded what humans could have developed independently. The logic is circular and the evidence non-existent, but ancient astronaut theories have proven remarkably popular, spawning television series, books, and a whole subgenre of speculative content that treats archaeological mysteries as evidence of alien intervention. Professional archaeologists and anthropologists view both lost continent theories and ancient astronaut theories with frustration bordering on anger. These pseudo-archaeological ideas do real harm to the understanding and appreciation of actual human achievement. When the construction of the pyramids is attributed to Atlantean survivors or alien engineers rather than to ancient Egyptian ingenuity and labor, it diminishes the accomplishments of Egyptian civilization. When Easter Island's moai are explained as remnants of Mu or as alien artifacts rather than as products of Rapa Nui culture, it disrespects and erases the real achievements of Polynesian peoples. The racism inherent in many lost continent theories becomes apparent when we examine which civilizations tend to be explained away by appeal to vanished supercivilizations or extraterrestrial intervention. The pyramids of Egypt, the moai of Easter Island, the megalithic structures of indigenous American civilizations, these non-European achievements are frequently the targets of theories suggesting they required help from lost civilizations or aliens. Meanwhile, European achievements, like the Parthenon or medieval cathedrals, are readily accepted as products of human ingenuity and effort. This double standard reveals an underlying assumption that non-European peoples could not have achieved sophisticated technology or monumental architecture without outside assistance. The real history of human civilization, when approached with rigorous methodology and respect for evidence, reveals achievements that are genuinely awe-inspiring without requiring appeal to lost continents or ancient astronauts. The navigation skills that allowed Polynesians to find and settle islands across the Pacific Ocean represent a triumph of human observation, memory, and courage. The engineering knowledge that allowed Egyptian architects to design and construct pyramids that have stood for over 4,000 years demonstrates sophisticated understanding of mathematics, materials, and organization. The astronomical observations recorded by Maya astronomers show mathematical sophistication and careful, systematic observation over centuries. These are human achievements, accomplishments of cultures that developed their own sophisticated knowledge systems through observation, experimentation, and accumulated experience passed down through generations.
When we attribute these achievements to outside sources, whether lost continents or extraterrestrial intervention, we rob humanity of its own history. We suggest that humans are not capable of greatness, that sophistication and advancement must always come from somewhere else, from some superior source. This is not only factually wrong, but also profoundly disrespectful to the peoples whose actual achievements are being explained away and dismissed. The persistence of Mu in similar legends in contemporary culture presents a challenge for science education and critical thinking. How do we help people distinguish between legitimate archaeological and historical research and the pseudo-archaeological speculation that continues to proliferate in popular media? Part of the answer lies in improving scientific literacy, helping people understand how scientific claims are evaluated, what constitutes evidence, and how the process of peer review and replication works to filter out unsupported ideas. Another part involves making genuine archaeology and history more accessible and engaging. When the true story of Easter Island's settlement and the creation of the Moai is presented compellingly, with attention to the human drama and achievement involved, it is more interesting than tales of sunken continents. When Polynesian navigation is explained in detail, revealing the sophisticated knowledge systems that allowed people to cross thousands of miles of open ocean using stars and waves and bird behavior, it captures the imagination more effectively than vague claims about ancient super-civilizations. The scientific method provides tools for evaluating claims about the past. We can ask, what is the evidence? Can it be independently verified? Does the interpretation follow logically from the evidence, or does it require adding assumptions? Are there alternative explanations that fit the evidence better? How does this claim fit with what we know from other lines of evidence? These questions, systematically applied, quickly reveal the problems with Mu and similar lost continent theories. The geological evidence from plate tectonics tells us that continents cannot sink the way these theories require. The archaeological evidence from Pacific islands shows patterns of settlement and cultural development that fit with gradual Polynesian expansion, not with refugees from a sunken continent. The linguistic evidence traces language families in ways that match the archaeological patterns and support independent development rather than diffusion from a single source. The genetic evidence confirms the archaeological and linguistic pictures, showing how Pacific populations are related to each other and to their Asian ancestors in ways that make sense without any appeal to lost continents. When all these independent lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion, that conclusion becomes very robust.
This is the power of scientific investigation. Not that any single piece of evidence is unassailable, but that multiple independent lines of evidence, all pointing to the same conclusion, make that conclusion extremely reliable. Plate tectonics, archaeology, linguistics, genetics, these different fields of study using different methods all agree that there was no Mu, no vast Pacific continent sinking 12,000 years ago. The consilience of this evidence makes the scientific conclusion as certain as scientific conclusions can be. Yet certainty in science does not necessarily translate to certainty in popular belief. Myths are resilient, particularly when they meet psychological needs that facts alone cannot address. The appeal of Mu lies not in evidence, but in story, in the narrative of lost wisdom and vanished greatness, in the romantic notion of ancient mysteries waiting to be rediscovered. These narrative and emotional elements give Mu staying power that scientific refutation cannot easily overcome. Perhaps what we need is not just to debunk Mu, but to tell better stories, stories that are actually true and that satisfy the same psychological needs that lost continent myths address. The story of how Polynesians settled in the Pacific is genuinely epic, full of courage and adventure and technical achievement. The story of how archaeologists gradually pieced together the history of Easter Island through careful excavation and analysis has its own detective story appeal. The story of how plate tectonic theory revolutionized Earth science, overturning established ideas through accumulation of evidence, demonstrates the power and self-correcting nature of scientific investigation. These true stories have the advantage of being true, of connecting us to real human achievement and real natural processes rather than to imagined worlds. They can inspire wonder and curiosity without requiring us to discard what we actually know about how the world works. They invite us to appreciate human ingenuity and the diversity of human cultures rather than homogenizing ancient achievements into a single lost super-civilization. As we stand today looking out across the Pacific Ocean, watching the sun descend toward the horizon and paint the sky in shades of orange and purple and red, we can appreciate the genuine mysteries that remain. There is still so much to learn about Pacific history, about the details of how specific islands were settled, about the cultural practices and belief systems of ancient Pacific peoples. There are archaeological sites yet to be excavated, artifacts yet to be studied, oral traditions yet to be recorded and understood. The Pacific holds real mysteries, questions that legitimate research can address and answer, but Mu is not among those mysteries.
Mu is an answer invented for a question that did not need it, a solution to problems that were not real, a story that seemed to make sense in the context of 19th and early 20th century misunderstandings, but that cannot survive contact with modern scientific knowledge. The romantic appeal of lost continents will likely never completely disappear because humans are storytelling creatures drawn to narratives of lost paradises and vanished wisdom. But we can tell the difference between stories that are entertaining fictions and stories that make claims about actual history. The Pacific Ocean remains vast and deep, its waters concealing wonders of geology and biology that science continues to explore and document. Ancient Polynesian voyagers crossed these waters in one of humanity's most impressive achievements, settling islands across an ocean that covers nearly a third of the planet's surface. On Easter Island and other Pacific islands, stone monuments stand as testament to what human communities can accomplish through organization, skill, and persistence. These are the real mysteries and achievements of the Pacific, remarkable enough without adding imaginary continents. The story of Mu tells us less about the ancient past than it does about the times and people who invented and believed in it. It reveals the appeal of lost golden ages, the desire to find unified origins for human civilization, the tendency to underestimate the achievements of non-European peoples, and the power of compelling narratives to persist despite contradicting evidence. These are valuable lessons, even if they are not the lessons that Mu's proponents intended to teach. As night falls across the Pacific and stars emerge in the darkening sky, those same stars that guided Polynesian navigators across vast distances, we can appreciate the ocean for what it actually is, not a grave for vanished continents, but a highway for human migration, not a mysterious void, but an environment that humans learn to traverse and understand. The real story is more interesting than the myth, the true achievements more impressive than the imagined ones. If you found this journey through the legend of Mu interesting,
If these tranquil waters and distant islands have accompanied you toward rest, consider leaving a like to help others find this exploration of mysteries both false and genuine. Subscribe to continue these voyages through history, legend, and the places where they intersect. The ocean of human stories is vast, and there are countless more shores to explore together, real and imagined, each with lessons to teach about who we are and where we come from. Sleep well and dream of true wonders that need no embellishment to inspire awe and fascination. The real world, properly understood, is remarkable enough.